Have you ever felt stuck trying to debug your AWS Lambda functions, wishing you could step through your Node.js code just like you do in Visual Studio with C#? If that's you, then you're in the right place. Today, we're diving into how to debug AWS Lambda functions written in Node.js. I totally understand how frustrating it can be when you're trying to troubleshoot your code but can't see what's going wrong. You're not alone in this. Many developers face similar challenges when working with AWS Lambda. Here's the specific question we're addressing today. One user asked, can we debug AWS Lambda functions written in Node.js like we do with .NET C# code in Visual Studio? This is a common concern, and it's a great question. Let's explore the options available. So what makes debugging AWS Lambda functions a bit tricky? Unlike traditional applications, Lambda functions run in a serverless environment, which can complicate the debugging process. But don't worry, we have some effective strategies to help you out. And stick around. I have a powerful debugging tip at the end that can save you a lot of time and headaches. To debug AWS Lambda functions written in Node.js, the user should first set up their local development environment. This involves installing the AWS Command Line Interface, or CLI, which allows for easier interaction with AWS services. Next, the user should configure their AWS credentials. This is essential for the AWS CLI to access the user's AWS account securely. Now, the user can create a new Lambda function or use an existing one. They should ensure that the function is set up to allow debugging, which can be done by enabling the appropriate logging. To debug the function, the user can use the AWS SAM-CLI, which allows for local testing and debugging of Lambda functions. They should install the SAM-CLI and then run their function locally. Finally, the user can view the logs generated during the execution of their Lambda function. This can be done through the AWS Management Console or by using the AWS CLI to fetch logs. Fun fact, did you know that AWS Lambda was launched in 2014? It has since revolutionized how we build and deploy applications in the cloud. Now, let's look at the answers provided by other users. An alternative approach to debugging AWS Lambda functions in Node.js involves using Visual Studio Code and the Lambda local framework. First, set up a launch configuration in Visual Studio Code with a launch.json file to start a debug session. Next, install the Lambda local framework to execute your Lambda function. You can invoke your function using a specific URL format that includes a GUID parameter for product details. Finally, write your lldebuggdetail.js code to call the getDetail function. With everything set up, you can set breakpoints in your code and step through it during the debug session. That's it for that answer. Let's take a look at another one. An alternative approach for debugging AWS Lambda functions in Node.js is to use the Sigma IDE. This tool allows you to step through your code while it's running in AWS, providing a more interactive debugging experience. That's it for that answer. Let's take a look at another one. An alternative approach to debugging AWS Lambda functions in Node.js is to run your Lambda locally. You can use tools like Lambda Local and Serverless Offline to simulate the Lambda environment on your machine. By invoking your Lambda with test events and data, you can log outputs and see how your function responds to different inputs. Let's take a moment to review another user's answer. An alternative approach comes from Trek10, who recently released a tool that allows you to step through Node.js code live in AWS Lambda functions. This tool works by forking your code into a child process running in debug mode and proxies connections to your local Chrome DevTools. That's the end of that answer. Let's see another perspective. One alternative approach for debugging AWS Lambda functions in Node.js is to create a separate debug file. First, create a file named debug.js and call your Lambda function from there. For example, use the code const app equals require-index app.handler. Next, update the program entry in the launch.json file to point to your debug.js file. Set it like this: program workspace folder /debug.js. Finally, you can set a breakpoint on the line where you call app.handler. This allows you to step through your code, just like in Visual Studio. Here's that powerful debugging tip I promised. Always include comprehensive logging in your Lambda functions. This habit will make troubleshooting much easier and faster. And there you have it. You now have the tools to debug your AWS Lambda functions effectively. Remember, logging and local debugging are your best friends. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe for more tips and don't miss our next video where we dive deeper into AWS best practices.